Schönen guten Abend und herzlich willkommen zu unserem Live-Talk. Ich freue mich sehr, dass wir etwas zum Thema Ehe für alle machen können. Der Titel ist Gleichgeschlechtliche Eltern, gefährdetes Kindeswohl. Wir haben jetzt in diesen Tagen viel gehört, in verschiedenen Fernsehsendungen oder auch Zeitungsartikel, Zeitungsinterviews ging es immer wieder um die wissenschaftliche Sicht auf dieses Thema. Es ging darum, was Studien sagen, was der wissenschaftliche Konsens ist. Und gleichzeitig wurde aber kaum wirklich in die Tiefe gegangen, konkrete Studien genannt. Und deshalb fanden wir es gut und richtig, dass wir einen Faktencheck machen können, und zwar mit Experten, wo wir ein bisschen tiefer gehen können. Und es freut mich, dass Sie da dabei sind. Herzlich willkommen. Wir haben kurzfristig verschiedene Experten eingeladen. Und zwar unter anderem haben wir Professor Moritz Daum von der Universität Zürich eingeladen. Er ist Entwicklungspsychologe. Er hat sich auch unter anderem, wurde sein Zitat verwendet in der Arena-Sendung. Er hat sich also da involviert und geäußert. Und wir haben ihn darum gebeten, auch mitzumachen. Es war etwas kurzfristig, aber wir haben sogar angeboten, dass er carte blanche bekommen würde auf der Webseite, der Referendumswebseite, wenn er da teilnehmen würde. Aber leider war es nicht möglich. Ebenfalls eingeladen war Professor Dr. Margrit Stamm. Sie war Teil des Faktenchecks des Schweizer Fernsehens, aber sie hat leider auch abgesagt. Dann Dr. Ney von der Universität Basel, dann Dr. Christine Neeresheimer. Sie ist von der Pädagogischen Hochschule Zürich und sie hat leider ebenfalls abgesagt. Ebenfalls angefragt wurde Dr. Michael Braunschweig. Er ist stellvertretender Leiter des Instituts für Sozialethik. Und so ist es uns leider nicht möglich, Leute vom sogenannten Mainstream, vom sogenannten wissenschaftlichen Mainstream in Bezug auf dieses Thema zu gewinnen. Wir werden aber mit ihren Zitaten arbeiten. Wir werden mit dem arbeiten heute Abend, was sie gesagt haben in verschiedenen Interviews. Und wen wir aber gewinnen konnten heute Abend, sind Leute, die eben nicht vom Mainstream sind, aber trotzdem Spezialisten auf diesem Gebiet, Fachleute. Ich heiße herzlich willkommen hier in diesem Live-Talk Professor Dr. Walter Schamm. Herzlich willkommen. Professor Schamm, Sie sind Professor für angewandte Humanwissenschaften an der Kansas State University. Sie haben verschiedene Abschlüsse, unter anderem in Physik, aber dann Family and Child Development und einen Doktortitel in Family Studies. Und Sie unterrichten unter anderem Forschungsmethoden und Statistik. Und Ihr Hauptforschungsinteresse gilt Familien und auch, und das ist sehr spannend, Forschungsgrenzen in kontroversen Bereichen, insbesondere wenn mächtige Interessen der Forschung mehr Glaubwürdigkeiten verleihen, als sie verdient. Und weiter sind Sie ein Fellow des National Council on Family Relations. Schön, dass Sie dabei sein können, Dr. Schamm. Dann ebenfalls dabei ist Professor Paul Solins. Dr. Solins, Sie sind Soziologe an der Catholic University of America und Ihre Fachgebiete sind unter anderem Geschlechtertheorie und sexuelle Orientierung, dann die eheliche Familie und Religionssoziologie. Sie haben 4 Bücher publiziert und über 150 wissenschaftliche Zeitschriftenartikel, Buchkapitel, Forschungsberichte verfasst. Und wichtig für unsere Diskussion ist auch, dass Sie an großen Studien zum Thema von Auswirkungen unterschiedlichen Familienstrukturen auf die Kinder, dass Sie daran beteiligt waren und zum Teil die auch selber durchgeführt haben. Schön, dass Sie dabei sind, Professor Solins. Und wie gesagt, sehr schade, dass niemand anders sich die Zeit nehmen konnte, um heute dieses Gespräch zu führen. Aber wir wollen es nichtsdestotrotz durchführen. Jetzt zu Beginn habe ich ein paar Fragen vorbereitet, die ich in den Raum stellen möchte und wo ich dann Sie beten werde, Professor Schamm und Professor Solins, uns einfach Ihre Meinung, Ihre Ansicht kundzutun. Und dann am Schluss werden wir auch die Möglichkeit haben, von den Zuschauern Live-Questions, Live-Fragen entgegenzunehmen. Und da bin ich schon sehr gespannt, was noch kommen wird. Ich danke euch schon bereits jetzt für die Zeit und für das Engagement. Bevor wir das Hauptthema von heute Abend, bevor wir das angehen, nämlich das Kindeswohl, gerade auch in Regenbogenfamilien, wollen wir noch ein Thema angehen, ich glaube, das von großer Bedeutung ist. Und zwar geht es um wissenschaftliche Vorurteile. Ich glaube, das sollten wir besprechen zusammen. Und zwar wird immer wieder gesagt, zum Beispiel auch in dem Faktencheck von der Arena, hat Margrit Stamm gesagt, dass Studien, welche nicht mit dem Mainstream übereinstimmen, mit dem wissenschaftlichen Mainstream, dass Studien, welche sagen, dass das Kindeswohl weniger gut ist in gleichgeschlechtlichen Beziehungen, Familien, als in traditionellen Ehebeziehungen, dass diese Studien ideologisch motiviert sind. Wir sehen ja auch heute Abend zum Beispiel, Herr Professor Salins hat da sehr interessant ein Priestergewand an. Und ich meine, das schreit ja eigentlich wirklich danach Ideologie, oder? Und das ist da ja nicht zu vereinbaren, Ideologie und Wissenschaft. Ich möchte aber, bevor ich gerne Sie da zu Wort kommen lasse, noch auf etwas hinweisen, was vielleicht nicht so bekannt ist. Und zwar gibt es sehr wohl Vorurteile, aber die kommen nicht so sehr immer von religiöser Seite, wie man das eigentlich immer zu sagen pflegt, sondern die kommen eben gerade auch aus dem Mainstream. Schon bereits vor 10 Jahren gab es einen Artikel in der New York Times und dieser Artikel in der New York Times, der hat da einen Professor Dr. Jonathan Haidt von der New York University zu Wort kommen lassen. Und zwar ging es darum, dass damals eine große Konferenz stattfand mit Experten, wo es um das Thema Diskriminierung ging. Und Jonathan Haidt ist dann vor diesen etwa 1000 Wissenschaftlern gestanden und hat gesagt, eine Diskriminierung, die haben wir bis jetzt noch nicht behandelt. Und zwar geht es um die Diskriminierung gegen konservativ eingestellte Wissenschaftler. Er sagt, und ich zitiere ihn da aus diesem New York Times Artikel, Social psychologists are a tribal moral community united by sacred values that hinder research and damage their credibility and blind them to the hostile climate they've created for non-liberals. Also er sagt, dass es im Bereich der Sozialpsychologie, dass es da so eine Art moralische Stammesgemeinschaft gibt mit heiligen Werten und dass das eigentlich vieles an der Wissenschaft, an der Research behindert und auch die Glaubwürdigkeit beeinträchtigt und dass es wirklich ein feindseliges Klima gibt in Bezug auf Nichtliberale, in Bezug auf Konservative. Und er hat dann das auch weiter untersucht und dazu auch publiziert. Und das möchte ich gern als Kontext mal hinstellen und noch als letztes eine Antwort lesen, die wir jetzt gerade erhalten haben von der Sendung Arena auf unsere Beschwerde, dass nur über eine Seite berichtet und kommuniziert wurde. Und ich lese da vor, es heißt, besten Dank für Ihre Nachricht und Ihre Kritik, die wir mit Interesse zur Kenntnis genommen haben. Margrit Stamm, das ist eben die Wissenschaftlerin, die diesen Faktencheck dann gemacht hatte, der nachgereicht wurde. Margrit Stamm ist eine renommierte Erziehungswissenschaftlerin, die nicht ihre persönliche Meinung, sondern den wissenschaftlichen Konsens vertritt. Es stimmt nicht, dass die Wissenschaft in dieser Frage gespalten wäre. Die Redaktion hat im Vorfeld der Sendung geradezu diese Frage intensiv recherchiert und mit verschiedenen Wissenschaftlerinnen und Wissenschaftlern gesprochen, unter anderem auch mit Professor Dr. Moritz Daum, Entwicklungspsychologe und Leiter der Fachrichtung Säugling und Kindesalter, der in der Sendung zitiert wurde. Eine gegenteilige wissenschaftliche Position zu veröffentlichen und gleich zu gewichten, würde deshalb nicht der Ausgewogenheit dienen, sondern wäre ein Fall von False Balancing. Also das wäre eine falsche Gewichtung, wenn man Stimmen wie die wir heute Abend hören werden, die zulassen würde. Das würde nicht der Ausgewogenheit dienen. Wir hoffen, dass wir Ihnen die Überlegungen der Arena-Redaktion etwas näher bringen konnten. Ja, soweit mal die Situation hier bei uns. Und jetzt würde es mich freuen, Dr. Salins und Dr. Scham, wenn Sie etwas dazu sagen könnten, wie Sie das erleben. Gibt es einen Bias? Gibt es einen Vorurteil gegenüber konservativen Forschern? Was sagen Sie dazu, dass Ihre Ansichten nicht mit dem Mainstream übereinstimmen? Bitte sehr.
I'd like to respond first, Walter. The answer to that question is yes. There are many biases. Every researcher approaches their research with a certain degree of bias. So one of the first things that we learn to do as scientists is to identify and set aside our biases to the greatest extent possible. What we're dealing with today, particularly on this topic, is something that goes beyond ordinary bias because it's a deeply controversial topic. It's one that represents kind of a clash of ideologies, and it's not just political interests that are brought up, but it's also profound personal and spiritual questions that go to the heart of human relationality. And so it is not surprising that people would be a little bit on edge and ideological about this particular topic. But what we're seeing, even in the responses that you've received from the arena, is that one side claims to own the dominance of the cultural gravitas on this topic, to the point that it doesn't even want to listen to ideas on the other side. And that's where it gets non-scientific. I call this reverse intolerance. It is, if you are a Marxist, you know, it's a good example of a Marxist revolution where, or maybe Marxist oppression, you know, where it is not the capitalists that are controlling the means of economic production to enslave the oppressed. It's persons who are trying to control the means of cultural production, the news outlets and the other means of communication, so as to oppress people with regard to the truth. And so there's a poverty of truth that comes out as a result of that. Now, I'm aware of Dr. Stam and her reputation, and she is a preeminent scholar, but you know, in her research, she's been an advocate for the importance of fathers in children's lives, which in other settings is also very controversial. Persons like Dr. Michael Lamb in England would say that Dr. Stam operates with an ideological bias because he doesn't believe that fathers need to be present in children's lives. Dr. Stam claims that they should. I think Dr. Stam has done great research on this and has made her case scientifically. So I just think it's not fair to say, oh, well, that other person, you know, it comes from an ideological point of view to the extent that we don't even need to listen to it. The claim that children do just as well in homosexual families as they do with a mother and a father is not a claim that's based on evidence. It's a claim that's based on authority. When they say the research is clear or the science is settled, that's an appeal to an authority that is analogous to a religious appeal. Everybody that matters agrees with me. We don't have to listen to anyone else. And it goes right back to the same kind of argument that was made by religious bodies hundreds of years ago and led to intractable disputes that were very difficult to even talk about, much less settle. So I call this the harm denial thesis. And it is a thesis that can be disproven by evidence. So my response would be to try to be ironic in my response to Dr. Stam or these others, Professor Daum, who doesn't want to engage in a conversation about this, is to say, have you read the research that you're saying is biased? What particular element in it is biased? Because when you do actually look at the bias, you find that the bias, at least on this topic, is very much on the other side. And I'd like to, at this time, ask if you would show image 1, because in 2015, after being accused of bias and looking at some of this literature, I did a study to examine whether or not there was bias. And in this study, I looked at 5 or 6 studies of children with same-sex parents that all used the same measure. I realized I had an opportunity here. The most common measure of child difficulties in the world is called the Strength and Difficulties Questionnaire. It is incorporated in all World Health Organization surveys and most national health interview surveys, certainly here in the United States and in Germany and in Canada, and I don't know all of the other countries, but it is one of the best measures we have to predict general difficulties for children in families or in other settings. And so here I'm comparing 5 different studies that have all used the exact same measure. Now, their findings should be fairly comparable across the different populations that they study. This measure has been normed in all of these populations. It should track those differences. But what I found is that there was a huge difference in the outcomes of these studies depending on one simple factor, and that is, did they use a statistically representative random sample or not? And that's really the Achilles heel of the claim that there's no difference for children with homosexual parents than with man-woman parents, because here I can show you, we could expand this argument at the bottom of this chart where it says Table 3, correspondence between sample type, random or recruited, and comparison type, favorable or unfavorable. You can see that the first 2 studies, which did use a random sample, the percent of favorable comparisons that they reported for children with same-sex parents were 0. Now, they reported no differences, but they also reported no advantages. The 2 studies at the very bottom, Wainwright and Patterson's 2 studies, also reported no different using a random sample. The 3 studies in the middle that used recruited non-representative samples all reported a large degree of favorable comparisons for children with same-sex parents. Now, how can that happen? That can only happen if those samples are biased. This is a solid evidence of statistical bias. It comes out of an ideological bias by the authors of those studies. Now, I'm not complaining about them or judging them to do that. It's a problem for all science. But this was Boss's study in 2010, Gallenbach's 2013 study, and the well-publicized ACUS study out of Australia in 2014. They all used convenience or recruited samples, and they all reported much more favorable findings for children of same-sex parents than other studies that use random samples, even other studies by pro-LGBT scholars who want to claim that there are no differences. And so what my conclusion in this study, and you can read it, is that there is bias, a lot of bias. And the problem in this whole area of research, at least one of the problems, Walter can tell us about more problems, but the main problem in my mind is the lack of statistically representative samples from which people claim to draw conclusions. And then on the basis of those conclusions, which are politically palatable to lots of people, they say we don't even need to listen or look at the studies on the other side.
Mhm. Vielen Dank. Und nur damit wir das verstehen, Random Samples und Convenient Samples. Da geht es darum, bei Random Samples, dass wirklich zufällig die Daten ausgewählt werden. Und Convenient heißt, dass man auf Leute allenfalls sogar zugeht oder dass man die Samples selber auswählt. Können Sie da noch etwas dazu sagen?
Right. Yes, I could. I bet you that Walter could do a better job at that, though.
Yeah.
What do you think, Walter?
I don't know. You're very eloquent, Paul.
Yeah, so are you. Well, okay, I'll answer if you don't want to, but a convenient sample means you just go to the people closest to you. And they're usually collected by going down to your local LGBT bookstore or a political organization and finding out who's there and just talking to people that are there and then asking them if they or their friends would like to participate in this study. This is called a snowball sample. So you collect people who are just easy to get. You make no attempt at all to try to get a sample that is randomly selected so it could be statistically representative of a population. And those kind of samples are always biased. The best pro-LGBT scholars have always recognized that they are biased. I have statements here from Gregory Herrick and from others who say you can't draw any conclusions about a population based upon these convenient samples. The American Sociological Association says the same thing. So they will say this, but then in the political forum, they'll say, oh, the science is settled. It shows that there are no problems with children. Well, they do that because they want to get a particular political outcome. But if you look under the hood just a little bit, even a lot of the scholars that put out these studies say in the studies that we really shouldn't depend on this study to draw any conclusions about the population. Now, on the other hand, a random sample is one where you look at the population you're going to sample, and it takes a lot more work. You have to rigorously construct a sampling frame where you're going to sample randomly. Like if you could line everybody up in the population from one end to the other, and you take every 10th person or every 15th person, or you take random digits out of the telephone book, and you dial 1,000 telephone numbers at random. In those ways, you're going to get a very random selection of the population. And so the characteristics of the population that are going to affect the outcome of your study are going to be evenly or randomly distributed. You're not going to be selecting for any particular group, and so you're not going to bias the study. I like to give as an example, if you're going to do a study of the religiousness of a population, a random sample would, select every 20th person in the population or whatever you have and ask them how religious they are. A convenience sample would be like going to a Bible study or to a church that and say, well, how religious you are. And then reporting that as the religiousness of the population. Well, you can tell that in the second case, that wouldn't be accurate at all. The people that are there in that particular special setting are going to be very, very different on that measure than the general population. And so that's the kind of research that that's being proposed to us with regard to this study. I do want to say one more thing about Jonathan Haidt, since you brought it up, and this is very interesting. But people have done follow-up work on his thesis that there's trenchant pro-liberal bias in scholarly settings. And one of the best follow-up works that I know is by Christopher Smith at the University of Notre Dame, and it's called The Sacred Project of American Sociology. And he makes the same argument in another way, looking at different studies that have been put out and showing that they are really affirmations of religious belief in the guise of scientific or sociological studies. And then also people have looked into the question of reproducibility of studies. When you publish a scientific study, it's supposed to be that another scholar can come along and take your description and can replicate that study. And so there have been replication studies that have taken like the 100 top studies in a field and found out how many can be replicated. And unfortunately, very, very few can be replicated. It's usually only a single-digit percentage, less than 10% of all studies published today can actually be replicated. Well, that's a direct sign of bias and of difficulty in the scholarship.
Ja. Das bedeutet, dass mit den Convenient Samples, dass es oft auch so ist, dass Leute, die dann teilnehmen an diesen Studien, dass sie wissen, was auf dem Spiel steht, was es bewirken wird, diese Studien. Und wenn sie dann selber berichten über ihre Situation,
Yes.
dann wissen sie, was es für einen Einfluss haben wird.
That's right. It does affect that kind of bias, desirability bias. If you know what the researcher wants to hear, people are more inclined to give that answer, right? We see this a lot in studies of children where parents are going to respond according to what they think are going to make them look good as parents. You know, that's a parental bias. And mothers do this more than fathers. So I've found in my research that I have to control for whether the person answering is mother or father. I don't think actually any of the pro-gay scholars have ever controlled for this, but there's a big bias between whether the person that's telling you their child is doing well is their mother or their father. And not only is there that kind of bias, but there's also selection bias. And so people whose children might be in more trouble are going to be more likely to say, no, I don't think I want to participate in this study, right? Or the researcher might be less likely to pursue that person for the study. Or when they ask, well, doing the snowball sample, can you recommend some of your friends who we could also include in the study? People are not likely to recommend friends where their children are having lots of trouble as much. So there's also that kind of bias.
Das heißt also, wenn wir eine Unbalanciertheit haben.
Can I step in?
Please.
Ja, gern, ja. Gerne.
Okay, well, one of the first things that's important to understand about science is that science is about finding the unexpected. If you're a scientist and you only want to find the expected results, I claim you're not really much of a scientist. You have to be open to finding unexpected results. If you're not open to finding unexpected results, then you're pretty much an ideologue. And so these people will claim that, you know, there's only one answer, but to me, it appears they're not being open to finding different things. And so one advantage, I think, of being a Christian is that I'm open to a lot of different options. So I've happened to have found a lot of different things that other people didn't find. Well, who's biased in that case? Is it me that's finding stuff other people didn't, or is it the other people that can't seem to ever find anything different? Now, specifically, some of the work I've done is to look at how people cite journal articles. And we have several published papers that take articles that found a positive result for same-sex parents and articles that found a negative result, generally by the same authors, the same university, same sample even. And the citation rates generally run about 10 to 1 that the positive articles get cited and the negative articles don't, even though the quality of the research is about the same. Now, we recently published a paper where we looked at what I call macro level social desirability, and we predicted whether people would find the mainstream answer or something different. And basically, the mainstream answers were cited more often, regardless of the quality of the study. And the higher the quality of the study, the less likely they were to find the mainstream answer. Now, they'll say that, well, science has this consensus. And they're right. We did a study one time of 72 literature reviews from 2001 to 2017. And over 90% of those literature reviews claimed that there were no differences in children's sexual orientation as a function of their parents. But not one of those studies looked at more than 45% of the data. So they all were inherently biased because none of them even had 50% of the available research cited in their piece. And the people who dared to disagree would usually cite just one or two studies. However, when I published a paper recently, we cited 59 studies that had looked at this issue. And I've recently got a meta-analysis published that shows that when you look at the total range of studies, gay parents, same-sex parents are more likely to raise children who become LGBT. And so I think the evidence, if you want to look at evidence, is very clear that the hundreds of scholars who've staked their claim to no differences are just wrong. They're just flat wrong. Now, I've published all my stuff. It's out there in the open. If they don't like it, they have 50 million ways to make themselves famous and criticize it. But they're not doing it. And I think they're not doing it because they're afraid that if they take me on one-to-one, head-to-head, I'll bury them intellectually. Now, I have an advantage over them. I know that I'm going to get all kind of knives in my back if I'm not very accurate. They don't have to worry about that. They can say anything they want to say, and everybody's going to stand up and clap. They don't have to prove anything. They don't have to have any evidence at all. They can just say whatever they want, and nobody's going to get upset. As a conservative, I have to be careful because if I say something, I have to be able to back it up. And that means I have to dig under the hood and dig really deep into it. And so when I say something, I know what I'm talking about because I've dug into the literature, I've reanalyzed the literature, so I understand it. Now, on citation bias, I was saying that even authors that do their own research will cite their favorable publications over their unfavorable publications. An example is one set of researchers, Gartrell et al., they found that the drug use rate, illegal drug use rate for children of same-sex parents was basically 60%, 59.2 if you used a certain denominator. The comparison sample was 20.5%. You probably never heard of that study. Mm-hmm. You may never hear of it again. It's been deep sixed. But yet, what more could you want? 3 times the illegal drug use of children that are 17 years old? But you haven't heard of that. You're not going to hear any of these other professors mention in that study because it doesn't fit the narrative. So the people that are using evidence are Dr. Sullins and myself.
Yep.
And that's why they don't want to challenge the evidence. They just want to throw out accusations and criticisms and say, oh, well, they're biased. Well, sure, that's easy to say. It's a lot easier to say that than actually prove that we're wrong about something.
I want to second that. Not to cut Walter off, but in my studies, particularly my 2015 study, which has received the most pushback, not a single scholar has tried to refute the study or tried to recharacterize or show some sort of error with the study. What they have done is to disparage the journal in which it was published, disparage me because I'm a religious person and I must be biased, tried to not cite it. I had one study that talked about the topic and tried to push back against the whole idea I presented in that study, 14-page study, and they did all of this without ever citing the study that they were criticizing. They didn't want to cite my study so other people would read it. It was amazing. It was Orwellian that they would go to such extents. And so we're not meeting people who want to look at the evidence and consider reason. We're looking at people who want to appeal to authority. And when they say, oh, this is a discredited author, that's exactly right. They're trying to discredit, not disprove, not argue against, but somehow remove the credibility from the research that we do. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that in support of Walter's point, and I hope you have more to say, Walter.
Yeah, well, for example, this is just one example. This is a particular study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine.
Oh, yeah.
And it purports to claim that there's no differences in mental health between children of lesbian mothers and a comparison sample. Well, if you look at the table, you'll find that anxiety and depression is significantly different. And the effect size, if I remember right, was 0.46. And there's a variety of other results that are pretty close.
Mm-hmm.
But what you don't hear about is that if you take the next paper they published and you take the same data for the same people, the numbers don't add up. They come up with different means and standard deviations for these variables across the two studies, which means one of the studies is wrong. That's just all there is to it. And if you look at the standard deviations, they use standard errors here, but it's the same thing. Out of the 21 tests, 18 of them had exactly the same standard deviation. And that's only going to happen 10% of the time at best if you look at the last digit. And so it's utterly impossible for this study to be legitimate because that's just not going to happen. But you're not going to hear that criticism because it doesn't fit the narrative.
Yeah.
But this piece of research is basically nonsense. You can prove scientifically it's going to be nonsense. But yet that doesn't stop it from being quoted. Now, in order to prove it, what they did was they used the Bonferroni procedure. So if you look at two things and they're both significant, well, you find 18 other things to look at. And if they're not significant, then you divide by 20 and say, wow, now things aren't significant. All you have to do is just add a whole bunch of other variables in there that aren't significant, and you can negate anything you want. And we published a paper where we looked at where truck drivers, was their satisfaction being a trucker related to their income? And of course, you'd expect that to be the case. And we showed that if you just throw in enough variables, you can prove that there's no relationship between job satisfaction and satisfaction with income. You know, an obvious, it's got to be true kind of thing. But you can disprove it if, you know, just throw in enough variables and you can do it. And so you'll see a lot of the time when they claim there's no differences, it's because they've thrown in a whole bunch of other variables, and that allows them to ignore the results that they got that were significant.
Gut, also vielen Dank mal für diese Beispiele. Das heißt, wenn wir das alles uns vor Augen führen, dann sehen wir, dass die Balance wirklich schief ist, aber dass sie schief ist auf eine ideologische Art und Weise in die andere Richtung, nämlich gegen das konservative Gedankengut. Und vielen Dank mal für diese Beispiele. Jetzt möchte ich gerne, dass wir auf das eigentliche Thema zu sprechen kommen, nämlich die Behauptung von No Difference, dass es keinen Unterschied gibt, in welchem Setting ein Kind aufwächst, ob es in einem sogenannten Regenbogen-Setting ist, einer gleichgeschlechtlichen Familie oder ob es in einer traditionellen Ehe aufwächst mit Mama und mit Papa, mit den biologischen Eltern. Und da möchte ich jetzt ein Zitat vorlesen, das Zitat, das in der Arena kam, von Professor Moritz Daum von der Universität Zürich. Dieses Zitat wurde in der Arena-Sendung gebracht. Er sagt dort, die Forschung ist eindeutig, Kindern aus Regenbogenfamilien geht es genauso gut wie Kindern mit Vater und Mutter. Jetzt, wie ist das jetzt aus wissenschaftlicher Sicht, wenn ihr da jetzt etwas tiefer graben können? Weil eben dann Konkretes und Studien werden nicht wirklich genannt, sondern es kommen diese allgemeinen Statements. Und könnt ihr da in möglichst knapper Form ein paar Beispiele geben oder einfach sagen, was da wissenschaftlich, was es da zu sagen gibt zu dieser Aussage?
Right. I'll respond to that. Professor Daum's statement is emphatically and demonstrably untrue. In fact, it is behind the times because this is the so-called no difference thesis. which, back in the early 2000s, the APA was saying there was not a single study that showed deficiencies for children with same-sex parents. And today they've softened that claim to saying, well, the preponderance of research shows no differences with same-sex parents. So they've backed off the extremity of that claim. The research is definitely not clear on this point at all. And I'll point out what you've already pointed out. He doesn't cite any studies. Now, those who make that claim and cite studies, there's a very easy way to refute it, and that is to go read those studies, because almost every one of those studies, when it comes to describing the limitations of their study, they say you cannot generalize the findings of this study to a population. They say don't use this study to make the very claim that they're making. And that's my favorite way to refute them, because you don't have to appeal to any conservative scholar at all. In my brief for the Obergefell case in 2015, that's what I did. I and my co-authors, because the American Sociological Association made this claim, and they cited the studies. There were like 45 studies that they cited. So we read some of those studies and reported the limitations and the disclaimers in those studies. They refute this kind of statement altogether. It is very unscientific. Anytime you hear a scientist say the research is clear, you should hold on to your credibility there, because the research is never that clear in that way. Now, what I'd like to do is to show image 2 at this time. This will give you the kind of simplest evidence that I found in 2015 to refute this claim. Now, this is from the United States National Health Interview Survey. It's not some sort of conservative biased sample. It is the major source of health information on the US population. I'm looking at over 200,000 cases here of children. It's collected by the US Census. It is gold standard representative data. And all I have done in this chart is to look at the children who are with parents of the same sex compared to children of the opposite sex. And you can see the blue bars are those with same sex, the brown or orange bars, whatever color it shows on your screen, are the children with same sex, opposite sex parents. And you see here on the far left pair of bars is that strength and difficulties questionnaire, that very strong, well-validated measure developed by the Harvard School of Public Health to predict the percentage of children in populations that are susceptible to serious emotional problems. And you can see that among all opposite sex parents, it was 7.4%. Among all children with same-sex parents, it was 17.4%, much higher, significantly higher. All these differences are statistically significant at 0.01 or better. I don't want to belabor this, but it's clear that children with same-sex parents, if you just look at those two measures across the board, are much more susceptible to growing up with different emotional difficulties. Can we look at the next image? Image 3, I think it is. Yes, thank you. I also, a couple of years later, looked back again at the same data, because in another study that uses representative data, the National Longitudinal Survey of Adolescent to Adult Health, I had found one of those unexpected findings that Walter mentioned. And that is, I found that unlike what anybody believes, when you compare cohabiting same-sex parents with married same-sex parents, the children do worse with the married same-sex parents than they do with the cohabiting same-sex parents. Everyone thought that children would do better with married same-sex parents because they do a lot better with married opposite-sex parents. Here,
Also Moment,
you're looking,
ja, Moment kurz,
you look,
ja. Moment, also das ist ja genau das, was wir jetzt darüber abstimmen. dass die Ehe möglich sein wird. Das heißt, was Sie uns hier sagen, ist, dass in
Yes, it is.
verheirateten,
That's why I want to show you this
gleichgeschlechtlichen
chart.
Familien, dass es dort schwieriger wird und für die Kinder, dass es ein schlechteres Umfeld wird. Ja.
That's right. I have found that in 2 separate independent random population samples in the United States. Now here you see the 7.2%, that bar, it would be the children with opposite sex cohabiting parents in the United States in these data. You can compare that with that 7.4% in the first chart. That was all opposite sex parents. So it's a little bit lower than that, but pretty much the worst kind of opposite sex parents that you're going to get in the United States would be those that are unmarried, that are just living together in one way or another. And then if instead of just being cohabiting, those opposite sex parents are married, it drops to 4.4%. And that's pretty much the lowest rate of child difficulty you're going to find by family structure in the United States. That's the best condition for children that we know with respect to their emotional health. This means fewer than 1 in 20 children are susceptible to serious emotional problems when they're living with their own mother, their own father, who are married in an opposite sex marriage relationship. But then if you do the same comparison with same-sex parents, you can see that they start off cohabiting same-sex parents 13%. But when you move to married same-sex parents, it increases. It's almost 20% of children. 1 in 5 children with married same-sex parents in these data were at risk of or were predicted to develop serious emotional problems. Well, that's just the opposite of what everyone believes. I hear the gay advocates argue, well, if we let the gay folk get married, it'll be better for the children. No, it won't. It'll be worse for the children. They have this unfounded belief that the benefits of marriage that accrue to opposite sex families are also going to accrue in the same way to same-sex families. It is not true, as far as I know from these data and from other data that I've looked at. By the way, these results were confirmed by a team of pro-LGBT scholars who used the same data and tried to publish the opposite results. And I wrote a letter to the editor challenging the results. The journal made them redo the study, and they came up with results not only that confirmed what I just showed you, but actually showed even more differences, higher rates of difficulties for the children with same-sex parents.
Interessant und trotzdem wird das von Professor Daum oder Professor Stamm und so weiter, wird das mit keinem Wort erwähnt, diese Dinge. Man kann natürlich im Moment nur Vermutungen anstellen, warum dass es schlimmer wird für die Kinder, wenn sie bei verheirateten gleichgeschlechtlichen Eltern sind. Dass es noch schlimmer wird, als wenn es nur zusammenlebende gleichgeschlechtliche Eltern sind. Was sind da Vermutungen, warum das so sein könnte, dass es schwieriger wird, sogar noch wenn gleichgeschlechtliche heiraten für die Kinder?
Well, I don't know. That'd be my first answer. As an empirical scientist, I find this finding and I scratch my head just like you do, but I haven't thought about it. One of the differences is that the married same-sex relationships were of longer duration. And what I found in this study and in the previous study is that the longer the children have lived with same-sex parents, the more susceptible they are to these emotional problems. So that's one probability, or at least thought about that. Another one is that much of the difficulty that children face with same-sex parents is that they have transitioned from a former set of parents to their current set of parents. And we have robust research today that agrees that when children have to move from one set of parents to another set of parents or parent figures, it's troubling for them and it induces difficulties for them. We often see this happen in divorce, whether heterosexual or homosexual, and the child has to leave one or sometimes even both of their parents and go to live with another parent. We see it with children who are adopted. We see it with single parenting. And every time that happens, it brings about harm for children. Now, this is often lobbed as one of the big criticisms against studies like mine, is that somehow I haven't separated out the effects of transitions from the effects of being with same-sex parents. And in most of the cases, that's true. That's because that evidence is not in the data. And I can respond by saying none of the studies that claim no differences have made those distinctions either. But it's also true that when you talk about children with same-sex parents, you are by definition, by necessity, talking about children who have come into the care of those same-sex parents from some other set of parents, because two men or two women cannot produce a child. And so when that child comes in, transitions from some other set of relationships, it's not something that's accidental or external to that relationship. It's constitutive of that particular arrangement. You're building a family structure where that's going to be the case for all the children who enter in. Now, there is an exception if you have lesbian mothers who conceive via donor insemination, then you could make a case that that child is going to grow up with both of those parents. And that's another complication, but that would be, I think, a qualification at best of the statements that I'm just making.
Das bringt mich zu einer weiteren Aussage. Zwar gab es ein Interview in der Basler Zeitung vom 6. September mit Dr. Christine Neres-Heimer. Sie war auch eingeladen für die Diskussion, die wir haben heute Abend. Und sie spricht da über Bezugspersonen, elterliche Bezugspersonen, und sagt eigentlich genau das Gegenteil von dem, was Sie uns gezeigt haben. Sie sagt da sinnesgemäß in diesem Interview, es braucht beides, männliche und weibliche Bezugspersonen, aber nicht nur oder nicht unbedingt als Elternpaar. Sonst wäre Kinder von Alleinerziehenden in irgendeiner Form benachteiligt. Familien, sagt sie dann weiter, sind ja nicht abgekoppelt von der Gesellschaft. Sie sagt, es gibt ja verschiedene Möglichkeiten, wie man männliche und weibliche Bezugspersonen haben kann in seinem Umfeld. Es braucht nicht ein Mami oder ein Papi unbedingt, sondern wenn etwas fehlt, dann findet man das im Umfeld, zum Beispiel durch Nannies oder Kindertagesstätten oder Onkel, Tanten, Großeltern, die auch diese Funktion, so wie ich diesen Artikel verstehe, diese Funktion genauso gut wahrnehmen können wie Eltern.
Well, again, let me respond to this because I've done research on this. And could you show image 4 at this point? Because that responds to this particular concern. I'm surprised that Professor Neersheimer would come up with such a statement, because it is true that children of single parents are disadvantaged. That's not a problem or an unusual finding. That's well known. And I think that even Professor Margaret Stam would disagree with this when she talks about the children needing their own father. She emphasizes that in her research. So this is simply not true. I think she's just coming up with this off the top of her head. I don't know of a study that would support this at all. The image that you see in front of you is direct evidence, again, from the National Health Interview Survey, comparing by family form. And here you see with two married biological parents in this particular set of data, it was 4.9%. This was the lowest measure here. And then using the same variable, you can see that the trouble for children increase as you change the family form. Well, here are single parents. They're almost 10% of children with single parents, twice as much as with two married biological parents. Children do not do as well with single parents. That is a mainstream finding. It's not some sort of exotic thing. The best book on this would be by Andrew Cherlin at Johns Hopkins University. It's called The Marriage Go Round. It has a whole chapter on single parenting and the difficulties of children with single parents, because most single parenting follows divorce. What happens in a divorce, and here I would point you to the work of Frank Furstenberg back in the 1980s and 90s, who pointed out that after a divorce, custody, at least in the United States, generally goes to the mother, and the child's relationship with the father, they still have contact with the father, but it's very different. It's a visitation. They don't live day in and day out with that father, and there's a falseness and a shallowness that enters into that relationship. All of these other persons that Professor Norsheimer is pointing to for involvement in people's lives are not involved at the level of a parent. Nannies, daycare centers, grandparents, those aren't bad. If you're recovering or trying to overcome, to some extent, the difficulties that a child may have because they don't have a father or a mother in the home, that's a good thing. It can help to ameliorate the harm to some extent, but it's certainly not a family form that you would want to choose. We would not want to create a society where we would say, yes, we can have children, but the mother and father can't raise them. Instead, we should have nannies and daycare centers raise them. That would be a recipe for harm and difficulty for those children. So that's all I want to say. Maybe Walter would like to add some other stuff.
There was a study done back around 2002 by Charlotte Patterson, where she looked at the relatives and the friends of the children that had same-sex parents. And from what I remember, I haven't looked at it for many years, but from what I remember, there was a mix of male and female friends or relatives.
Yes.
However, there was a predominance of gay or lesbian friends or relatives that were involved with the child. So you might be able to argue there was somewhat of a balance in terms of gender, but there certainly wasn't a balance in terms of sexual orientation of the contacts the children had. Now, the other thing I want to throw in is that a lot of these no different studies were based on questions asked of the parents.
Yes.
And the parents oftentimes had more money, more education, and fewer children than the heterosexual parents.
Right.
And my best analogy to this is, what if you had a pro soccer team competing against an elementary school soccer team, and they played to a tie? You wouldn't go around saying, man, that pro team was fantastic. They tied this elementary school team. But you're doing the same thing. You're cherry picking highly educated, wealthier, same-sex parents, and then you compare them to poor, highly stressed parents with lots of children. And then when they come out the same, you think, wow, what an amazing result. Well, it is amazing. It's amazing they didn't just blow them out of the water with all the advantages they had. And in some of the studies, as shown in my book, I put the details in my book.
There you go. Show us your book.
Yeah, in this book here, I put the details in there. And in many cases, when you ask the children how they're doing, and you ask the teachers, they're doing better in spite of the fact that there's a huge disparity in the income levels, in the educational levels. If you want to look at a recent study, Elwood et al. In Family Relations in December 2020 compared gay people versus heterosexual people in California. And the gay people had tremendously higher levels of income and education, but their mental health was far worse. Now, what's going on here? They're trying to claim we're minorities and we're oppressed. Well, a lot of people around the world would love to have more money and more education and fewer children and then be able to claim that they were oppressed. But you're not going to read this, you see, because it doesn't fit the narrative.
Hier
Well,
würde
I
ich
think
gerne,
an exception would be the recent study by Mazurkaj of the, I think it was the Danish administrative data, in which he makes the very same point that Walter just made, that the parents, the LGBT parents who raised their children from birth, these were donor insemination parents, had higher income and higher education than the rest of the sample, and that might be a confounder for the findings that they put out. So that was an honest study in that sense.
also hier wäre eine Frage interessant, die ein Zuhörer bereits stellt, und zwar jetzt aus der Sicht eines Kindes, wenn es wählen könnte zwischen einer dysfunktionalen, also einer schlechten, traditionellen Familie, Mann und Frau, oder einer funktionalen Same-Sex, also gleichgeschlechtlichen Familie. Was würdet ihr da als Wissenschaftler dazu sagen, zu einer solchen Frage?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer. It's apples and oranges. I would myself vote for the functional same-sex marriage in that case, because we know that dysfunctional families. Now, I'm imagining parents that have high degrees of conflict. That's the way it's usually studied. And parents who are sniping and fighting at one another are very, very damaging for children to be with. And almost any arrangement would be better than that. This allows me to make another point now. In the research that we do, we're talking about population averages. We're talking about general findings, right? I found that 17.4% of children with same-sex parents were predictive of higher emotional problems. That's twice as many as with opposite-sex parents, but it's still only 17.4%, right? It's less than 1 in 5. So it isn't, I'm not trying to make the claim that somehow being with same-sex parents is going to automatically ruin all children. There's a huge range. And I know children who've grown up with same-sex parents, and they love their parents. They're very thankful for the parents that they've had. They may also say that they're disappointed and they feel a sense of loss that one of those parents wasn't a father. By the way, the vast majority of children that grow up with so-called same-sex parents are really, we're talking about lesbian parents. 80 to 85% of children that are being raised by so-called same-sex parents are really being raised by two mothers. Well, so I wouldn't want to overstate the case or the difficulties. The problem is when you're deciding to establish a social form, you're not only enabling the possibility of children to be in one set of families versus another. What you're doing is, for the children that are in the care of those same-sex parents, you're denying them ever having the possibility of living with both of their father and their mother. Every single child is going to be denied the care of both their father and their mother. That's a radical change to make. And if it were to happen once in a while or occasionally or in the alternative to another failed family form, then maybe it could be defensible. But to set it up as a standard way of operating, it doesn't seem wise for any society to do.
Let me say something else. You have to be careful when we talk about same-sex parents, because in Gartrell's study, early on when the kids were, I think, about 10, they noted that some of the women who had started out as lesbian mothers had left the lesbian partner and now were with males.
Right.
But they don't say how many did that now. We don't know how many of the parents are actually lesbian mothers when the children were 25 years old. They won't tell us.
Yeah.
And we did a study here in Kansas, and we were looking at foster parents, and a third of the so-called same-sex parents were mother-daughter, sister-sister pairs raising foster children.
Right.
And so we have to be a little careful because sometimes it looks same sex, but that doesn't mean they're gay or lesbian. They
Right.
could be just same sex relatives. And so very few people are trying to tease that out.
Mm-hmm. One of the difficulties in talking about same-sex parents or same-sex marriages is that people have the image in their mind that it's going to be just like opposite-sex marriages. But the kinds of relationships that same-sex persons generally have, not all of them, but generally have, are very different than the kinds of relationships that a man and a woman will have when they enter into a marriage. For example, they are much less stable on average. The same-sex marriages that we studied tend to break up at a much higher rate than opposite-sex marriages. Walter could probably give you facts and figures on this even better than I could.
Ja, das ist ein interessanter Punkt, weil das wurde jetzt auch immer wieder in Interviews und in Fernsehauftritten, zum Beispiel von Nationalrat Hans-Peter Portmann, wurde das ins Feld geführt, wurde gesagt, dass gleichgeschlechtliche Beziehungen weniger Gewalt haben und stabiler sind und dass daher eigentlich besser ist für die Kinder, wurde wiederholt und wiederholt. Er hat zwar nie gesagt, welche Studie oder welche Grundlage er dafür hat, aber er hat sich auf die Wissenschaft bezogen. Stabilität und auch Gewalt.
Oh no, that's not true. Oh, there's a whole string of studies that look at that question and find intimate partner violence is higher in same-sex parents. The first one I'd point to would be Adam Messenger's 2014 study using the National Violence Survey, in which he found that not only was it same-sex males, up until that point they thought, well, two males together, they would be more violent, but not women. But he found that even lesbian couples had higher rates of violence than same-sex couples. There's also higher rates of child abuse of all different kinds with same-sex parents. I found this and reported it on the Ad Health study, and that study is out there that you can read about. I don't want to overstate that. But there is higher rates. It's if anyone says it's lower rates, that's simply false. And so there are higher rates of mismanagement of children. I don't know that I would want to make that in and of itself dispositive, but that it is true. Another difference between same-sex so-called marriages and opposite-sex marriages is the matter of sexual fidelity. Almost no gay male same-sex marriages are premised on sexual fidelity. When there are several good studies that have tracked this out. A majority of them have an explicit agreement for having sex outside of the marriage relationship. They claim that it's monogamous because they'll have sex with other men but not become emotionally involved with the other men. Just bare animal sex, I guess you'd call it.
Also
so they call that.
Das ist ein wichtiger Punkt, weil wenn wir reden über gleiche Rechte für das Gleiche, dann sehen wir auch hier, dass es nicht wirklich das Gleiche ist. Weil wenn wir von der traditionellen Ehe ausgehen, dann ist zumindest mal das Ziel, auch wenn es nicht immer gelingt, aber das Ziel ist es, dass man einander treu ist, sexuell treu ist. Aber diese Vorstellung, die besteht gar nicht bei den meisten schon von vornherein. Das heißt, es ist, wenn Sie von Ehe sprechen, sprechen Sie eigentlich von etwas ganz anderem.
That is correct. The point that I would make in this conversation is that if you have a young man or a young woman who's growing up in that kind of relationship, that becomes their model for their own lives. Children pattern their own romantic partnerships and their family formation on what they see their parents do. And so if you have that happen and they grow up in a same-sex family where there's not an expectation of sexual fidelity, then when they enter into a marriage, most of the children that grow up with same-sex parents are not going to be homosexual themselves. they're going to want to enter into opposite sex marriages and partnerships, they don't have that example of sexual fidelity. It becomes very disturbing and difficult to think about what expectations they may have. So it is a very different form of relationship in a number of ways.
Yeah, I want to add to that. In my book, I talk about a study, I believe it was by Green in Canada, and he was studying lesbian couples and gay men before they got married. And some of the lesbian women said they wanted to get married so they would have the security to be able to go out and have sex with other women.
Yes.
I mean, it's a total flip-flop of what heterosexual women would say. How many heterosexual women would say, I can't wait to get married so my husband can go out and have sex with other women? Wow, I'm so excited. I don't think you're ever going to find that. But with lesbian women, that's what you find. And so we're not talking about marriage in the same sense. And if you just think about the biology, I wrote a whole paper on this called The Marital Inequality of Same-Sex Marriage. People think they're bringing about equality, but you're really bringing about inequality because opposite sex couples have to work through physiological differences, major ones. They have to work through sexual differences. They have to work through communication differences. And there's some personality differences that are the same, but they have to pay a much higher price than same-sex couples do to start with. Even though they're providing society with the benefit of, generally speaking, more children and better adjusted children. So what this whole same-sex marriage thing does is it says, let's pretend everything's equal and take the people that are paying the price but providing the benefit for society. Let's kind of treat them as if they're no different than people who aren't taking the same cost, taking the same risks, and aren't providing the same benefit. It's creating a huge social inequity, not creating equality.
Ja, das ist ein interessanter Gedanke und das bedeutet, dass eigentlich die Gesellschaft geprägt und verändert wird. Etwas, das immer wieder gesagt wird, ist, was haben wir schon zu verlieren? Es hat genug Ehe für alle. Was kann man dabei schon verlieren? Und was wir daraus sehen, aus diesen Statements jetzt von Ihnen, ist, dass das Ganze viel fluider ist, auch in Bezug auf gelebte Sexualität, selbst aufgelebte sexuelle Orientierung. Und hier möchte ich gerne noch einen Artikel aus der Times zeigen vom Februar von diesem Jahr. Und vielleicht können wir das kurz auf den Bildschirm kriegen. Und dieser Artikel, der ist von Matthew Paris, ist selber schon ein Leben lang in einer homosexuellen Beziehung oder homosexuellen Beziehungen lebend und ein Advokat für dieses Leben und für diese Identität. Und er selber sagt, und aufgrund von einer Studie, die herausgekommen ist in England, nämlich, das kam auch in der Times, dass nur noch etwa 50% der Generation Z, also etwa 18- bis 25-Jährige in England, sich noch als rein heterosexuell orientiert bezeichnen. Das heißt, es findet ein Shift, eine Veränderung statt mit Maßnahmen, mit Richtungen, die wir einschlagen. Kinder werden geprägt und es ist nicht einfach alles so in Stein gemeißelt. Eine große Unwahrheit, die auch immer wieder verkündigt wird, ich denke da an die Arena-Sendung aus dem Jahr 2018, da war das Promi-Paar Taminik zu Gast. Ich habe da auch noch ein Bild davon als Erinnerung. Manchmal fehlt uns die Erinnerung an was eigentlich alles gelaufen ist in den letzten paar Jahren. Die Ex-Miss Schweiz Dominique Rinderknecht und ihre Freundin damals Topmodell Tammy Glauser. Und die waren das berühmteste Lesbenpaar in der Schweiz. Und Dominique behauptete, sie könne problemlos einen Vater ersetzen. Und sie machte sich dann auch stark und sagte, ja, was wollt ihr eigentlich? Wir haben uns das nicht ausgesucht. Das ist, also wir sind born this way, wir werden so geboren, das ist in unseren Genen bereits. Das ist die Botschaft, die immer und immer wieder kommt. Und jetzt gibt es genau inzwischen eine neue Schlagzeile. Sie ist mit einem Mann zusammen. Und das einfach zu zeigen, zusammen mit der Studie und dem Artikel der Times, dass die Sexualität viel fluider und viel formbarer ist und es sehr, sehr wichtig ist, wie wir als Kultur Signale setzen und wie wir prägen wollen, eheliche Treue, Mama, Papa und so weiter. Und da möchte ich kurz Sie fragen, was sagt da die Wissenschaft zu Born This Way? Gibt es da schon klare Erkenntnisse? Hat man da quasi ein schwulen Gen, ein homosexuellen Gen? Bin ich da determiniert? Ist alles festgelegt? Oder wie ist da der Stand?
Yeah, well, the latest emphasis in those who do research in this area is not the fixedness of sexual orientation, but its fluidity. Professor Lisa Diamond has the best book on this, and it's called Sexual Fluidity. The American Psychological Association has come out with norms that say that persons can have same-sex attraction and they can have opposite-sex attraction, and these are two independent parts of a person's life. So it is not the case that the more same-sex attraction you have, the less opposite sex. You can be high on both measures or low on both measures. And so if that's true, then the idea that someone is fixed in some particular orientation, right, is just false. We had the first very large, effective genome-wide association study 2 years ago last month. It came out in August 2019, which came to the same conclusion that there was an independence between a person's same-sex attraction and their opposite-sex attraction, and they proposed that research from this time forward use two different scales whenever it measured these things. Well, it did not go over very well in the field, and I don't think that people are going to move in that direction very, very fast, but I have been looking at some recent data where they do that. They measure them differently, and there is not a huge correlation between the two. We are influenced more by our environment and by our upbringing, and as the article you just showed, by cultural norms even, changing social environments, that we should have one type of sexual option as opposed to another type of sexual option. I think this kind of undermines the whole idea.
Das würde bedeuten, wenn jetzt die Ehe für alle angenommen wird und man dann sagt, jetzt muss man natürlich die Kinder entsprechend informieren und auch die Zurückgebliebenen auf dem Land vor allem die muss man jetzt aufklären über diese neuen Familienmodelle. Wenn das passiert und dann, ich sage jetzt mal die Experten wie Dr. Christine Nehresheimer ihre Leute schicken in die Primarschulen, in die Kindergarten und so weiter und da Aufklärungsarbeit machen, eben no difference, es gibt keinen Unterschied und so weiter, dann wird das auch selber eine Prägung haben und einen Einfluss haben auf unsere Gesellschaft, auf unsere Kinder. Das heißt, die Frage, haben wir etwas zu verlieren, wird sich etwas ändern, die kann man sehr klar beantworten mit Ja, aufgrund eben dieser Fluidität und dieser Formbarkeit und Biegsamkeit eigentlich der Kinder. Ist das so richtig?
Right. You can lose that. In the United States, we have two efforts that have followed the legalization of same-sex marriage. One is the beginnings of the push toward polyamorous relationships. And you now see articles and research pushing the idea of multiple aggregations of persons in some sort of sexual community or relationship, just like it was true for same-sex marriages back in the 1990s. And so, you know, if you disconnect the idea of marriage from being heterosexual, a man and a woman pair, then you open the question, well, why just a pair? If it's going to be two men who can get married, why not three men? Why not five? Why not two men and a woman? You can have all kinds of different openings. And now this is being celebrated as a new sexual freedom. by the same folk who celebrated same-sex marriage, but it opens, it's the slippery slope argument. The other thing that it opens is the ideas of gender dysphoria and gender identity. If you can change your sexual orientation fluidly by responding to cultural pressures and other norms, why can't you do that with your gender itself? And if you don't want to be a man, you can be a woman. You could move from an opposite sex marriage to a same-sex marriage without getting remarried. You just one of you change your genders, and then you're already there. And so it opens up a wider realm of uncertainty that I don't think people often engage or recognize about these issues.
No.
Yeah, I think it also, in those topic areas, there's an increasing trend not only for transgender issues, but for anti-religious issues. Yes. In other words, a lot of authors are trying to take some measure of religion and showing how it harms gay people or transgender people or same-sex marriages. And I think the long-term objective is to basically stigmatize religion. So we went from stigmatizing gay people, now we're going to try to stigmatize non-gay people or religious people. So it's the same thing, it's just kind of in reverse.
Ja, das bringt mich zu einem weiteren großen Thema. Ich denke, das letzte Thema jetzt, aber ein sehr wichtiges, nämlich das Thema der Diskriminierung. Es wird immer wieder gesagt, dass das Stigma und die Diskriminierung gegen die LGBT-Community, dass die verantwortlich ist für den größten Teil der psychischen Probleme und der Probleme, die wirklich um ein Vielfaches größer sind als bei anderen Kindern, wenn wir jetzt bei den Kindern bleiben. Dass es wichtig ist für die Kinder, dass man dieses Stigma verändert, und die Ehe für alle ist das Heilmittel oder ein wichtiger Schritt auf dem Weg, dass es weniger Diskriminierung gibt. Es wird gesagt, dass in Ländern, es wird immer wieder gesagt, auch wieder ohne Quellenangabe, aber es wird gesagt, in Ländern, welche die Ehe für alle einführen, dass dort die Diskriminierung sinkt und auch die psychischen Probleme, Suizidität und so weiter, Selbstverletzungen und so weiter, viele dieser Probleme, dass die ebenfalls abnehmen. Und das wird uns gesagt, dass das auch die Wissenschaft sagt, die Diskriminierung nimmt ab, und deshalb müssen wir das machen, weil dann auch die vielen Probleme abnehmen, welche diese Community hat. Da möchte ich gern Ihre Seite hören dazu, was da die Wissenschaft zu sagen hat.
Okay, well, I'd like to address the Elwood study looked at the mental health of lesbian and gay persons, married or not married, before California passed the same-sex marriage law, and then it looked at their mental health after California passed the same-sex marriage law. Now, what was interesting was before they passed the law, actually more gay or lesbian people had children. After they passed the law, the percentage was lower. But the biggest difference was about 22% of the people were married, and then 78% were single. What happened was when they passed the law, if you think this was a cause and effect thing, then the mental health of the married same-sex couples improved. But the mental health of the single gay and lesbian persons got worse. So the overall net effect was a negative 0.03, which wasn't significant. So essentially, if you looked at all gay people and all lesbian people, there was no effect overall. Okay, now they didn't break it down by who had children, so we can't say what was happening to the children, but it was a winner's loser situation. It appeared to help the married folks, but not the others. However, the alternative theory is that it was a selection effect. In other words, the mentally healthy gay people got married and the less mentally healthy gay people didn't get married. So the whole thing could be an artifact of a selection effect, rather than having anything to do with the law per se. So that's one of the more recent studies we've seen that looked at that particular issue.
Ja, lass mich hier.
I'll just make a couple of comments. I'm certainly not in favor of discrimination for LGBT people, and they certainly are a stigmatized minority. So I think there is that point is valid and has an effect. The problem is, if you're instituting marriage as a way of overcoming LGBT stigma, there's no evidence that marriage is going to have that effect. You could just as easily create a situation where LGBT marriages are stigmatized by the same people who stigmatize LGBT individuals. I read about once in a while people who have embedded stigma against LGBT people. It's not entirely rational, but I can't imagine that if you had some American redneck who was hating gay folk, and then you said, well, yeah, but now they're married gay folk, that somehow that stigma would disappear. I don't see that effect follows at all. Now, I can say something about stigma and discrimination against the children of same-sex parents, because I've looked at that very issue in a couple of studies, and I can report to you that they don't experience more discrimination than other children. In fact, in both studies that I've looked at it, they experience a little bit less. The difference is not statistically significant, but it is lower.
Also Moment kurz, ja. Also ich zitiere hier wieder Dr. Christine Neeresheimer in diesem Interview, das ich bereits erwähnt hatte.
Okay.
Sie sagt dort, Kinder von homosexuellen Paaren werden häufiger diskriminiert. Sie nennt zwar keine Studie, macht keine Angaben, aber also stimmt das gar nicht, oder?
This is the same professor who made those wild statements earlier without any source that simply go against the findings in the field. She's just wrong about that. They are not discriminated against more often. I've looked at the data myself. I've published the findings. She's welcome to read it if she wants. They are not discriminated against more often. The truth is that almost all children growing up in middle school and in adolescence experienced discrimination, stigmatization, bullying, teasing, adverse events for a variety of reasons. The most common reason is due to their weight or their height, but also, in America we have terrible racial discrimination, so it could be have to do with that. It could have to do with a host of other things, but it almost never has to do with their sexual orientation, because children who may be susceptible to that often don't disclose what their sexual orientation is. If you just think about it, children in school don't know a whole lot about the parents of their classmates. They don't know if they're married or separated or divorced, or they're living with their grandmother, or they're living with same-sex parents. That knowledge is just generally not widely shared. So it's not can't be a source for discrimination. Discrimination among children and adolescents happens because of what sociologists call ascribed characteristics, things that you can see in a person's presentation. And so it'd be physical characteristics generally that people are bullied about. So I've looked at this data myself. They do not suffer more discrimination, and they generally don't suffer discrimination due to their parents' sexual orientation. Now, if they're LGBT themselves, they may suffer some discrimination due to their own sexual orientation, but that's a different issue than being raised by same-sex parents. It is not the case that they suffer more invidious discrimination. With regard to this idea that discrimination is the cause of the mental health distress of gay persons generally, this is called the minority stress thesis. Yeah. It is very precarious as a proposition, because if you look at societies in which there is very little stigmatization, there's a high degree of tolerance toward gay and lesbian folks. For instance, the Scandinavian societies generally, you find that the rate of mental health difficulties for same-sex folk is just as high or higher in those settings than it is in much less tolerant societies like the United States or like some of the other smaller countries, like the Islamic countries, right? You find lower rates of distress in countries where they claim that there's more stigmatization. So there's something that doesn't add up. We don't have enough research and data yet to be able to fully address this question. I'm working on that some of those issues right now, but I don't think there's a lot of strong basis for the minority stress thesis generally. And even if there were, it wouldn't apply to children of same-sex parents.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. A gentleman named scholar named J. Michael Bailey published a paper in 2020
Yes.
where he said that the minority stress theory really needed serious reworking.
Right.
And there's been a debate going on between him and some other people about that.
Right.
So that theory is popular, and it's almost, the one pony thing that people go to all the time.
Right.
But if you really dig into it, it doesn't tend to hold very much water.
Right.
Gut. Ja, also vielen Dank mal für diese Präsentation. Ich denke, schauen wir, ob es noch Fragen gibt von den Zuhörern und Zuhörerinnen. Jetzt wäre der Moment, um noch Fragen zu schreiben. Und ihr habt so die Möglichkeit, dass Dr. Scham oder Dr. Salins darauf eingeht, wenn noch Dinge unklar sind oder man noch irgendwo noch tiefer graben will. Wir warten noch einen kurzen Moment. Gut, es scheint, dass wir sehr umfassend waren oder die Leute mal genug Informationen haben, um sich eine Meinung zu bilden. Ich fasse zusammen, dass wir verschiedene Statements angeschaut haben in Bezug auf das Kindeswohl. Wir haben Zitate verwendet von Wissenschaftlern, die in der Arena verwendet wurden. Auch Dinge, die gesagt wurden von unserem Bundesrat, zum Beispiel Bundesrätin Karin Keller-Sutter. Gerade erst kürzlich im Video am 12.09., wo sie sagt, und ich zitiere, für die Entwicklung von Kindern ist nicht die Familienkonstellation, sondern die Fürsorge und Zuwendung, die sie in der Familie erhalten. Mit der Ehe für alle entsteht niemandem ein Nachteil. Ich glaube, jede Person, die jetzt da zugehört hat, mit einer gewissen Offenheit, die hat jetzt, denke ich, schon gewisse Fragezeichen zumindest, gewisse Bedenken. Und meine Hoffnung ist für diese Abstimmung, dass wir zumindest eine Faktenlage haben, die mit der Realität übereinstimmen. Wer auch immer, dass Sie abstimmen werden, liebe Zuhörerinnen, liebe Zuhörer, das ist natürlich Ihnen überlassen. Aber ich glaube, wir konnten ein paar gute Schritte nehmen heute Abend, um die Faktenlage, die bis jetzt eigentlich ziemlich schief dargestellt wurde, in den Medien und auch in der Akademie, dass wir da zumindest etwas Gegengewicht geben konnten. Und ich danke vielmal fürs Zuhören, ich danke vielmal fürs Dabeisein. Wir werden diesen Talk online stellen und zur Verfügung stellen und bitte gebt doch den weiter. Es ist wichtig, dass die Leute wirklich eine gute Grundlage haben, damit wir auch abstimmen können aufgrund von einer guten Faktengrundlage. Ich möchte vielmal danken, auch besonders Professor Scham und Professor Salins. Vielen herzlichen Dank für diese über 1,5 Stunden. Und ich denke, wenn noch weitere Fragen kommen, die können gern ans Referendumskomitee gestellt werden. Wir sind da, wir sind offen für Dialog und selbst wenn sich dann auch noch ein paar von den Experten doch noch melden würden, dann sind wir sehr gerne bereit, um den Dialog weiterzuführen. So wünsche ich allen eine gute Nacht und vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein.